One time I went out looking for peace and justice. I was out there for over an hour. Okay, an hour and 20 years. 30, 40, some odd years. Anyway, it's a rough road, a long and winding road. So, where did I get to? Well, I actually haven't gotten very far in life in some ways. My grandmother grew up at 114th and Lenox in Harlem, and I live at 116th. Harlem's gotten farther than I have, not clear in what direction. But I did manage to get born in Seattle and live in San Francisco and Sacramento and North Carolina and Teaneck, New Jersey. I did grow up in a mixed neighborhood in Seattle that gradually became more white, as did every other neighborhood I've lived in, so I suppose I made that happen. Except in Sacramento, where it was already all white, and then started going the other way when I left. So I did that too. A lot of power, this guy. I started guitar at 15, singing Phil Oakes, Joan Baez, the Beatles. Just a word here on musical and cultural sources. As is common with secular Jews, which is to say agnostics, which is to say godless, my parents had Catholic tastes, at least in their record collection. I'd venture to say that Danny Kaye, born David Kaminsky, had more lasting effect on me than Chinese classical.
All her old shoes. Let's check on the veracity of Barrymore's vivacity and why a string capacity should get so much publicity. Let's even have a huddle over Harvard University, but let's not...
As did Josh White, and perhaps the Weavers, though they were a bit square for an ultra-hip 8-year-old. Though later I would come around and say, okay, square's not so bad. And of course the most important, Gilbert and Sullivan. Incidentally, there were 4 of us boys, and we're all still nuts.
I mean, working for social justice, of course.
My mom's illegal social workers strike was the first rally I played. I brought my band, seen here threatening to perform. We actually didn't have political songs yet, but in my defense, I grew up entirely without grapes. On purpose. My mom's purpose. Speaking of moms in general, and in particular, if you look closely at this picture from Occupy Wall Street, you will notice on the left a woman with no grapes. And yes, on the right is Mr. John Oliver conducting the skit that made him famous. I went downtown to interview the local representative of the Farm Workers Union. I think this was my first time meeting somebody from another culture and class who worked to put food on my table, or in this case in the store where he told me not to buy it. And my first chance to meet somebody engaged in a collective struggle to wake up our country to the fact that there are other people who don't have what we have, and why not? That was a big first. 20 years later, I would meet people like that in Mexico, doing political theater, and traveling with a Nicaraguan theater troupe, and in El Salvador, people organizing and administering their village in the middle of a war zone. My first fateful career decision in the 11th grade was to decline to take chemistry, which meant I couldn't get into UC Berkeley. It occurred to me later, well, yesterday, that maybe I did that because the song about the periodic table of the elements had already been writ. To wit.
There's sulfur, californium, and fermium, berkelium, and also mendelevium, einsteinium, nobelium, and argon, krypton, neon, radon, xenon, zinc, and rhodium, and chlorine, carbon, cobalt, copper, tungsten, tin, and sodium. These are the only ones of which the news has come to Harvard. And there may be many others, but they haven't been discovered.
This chemistry debacle was followed by a second decision in the 12th grade to decline college, at least for the moment, and to take a job. Okay, first let me point out that I was doing some form of journalism in high school. In fact, I was on the school paper staff, and they went out of their way to show me the censorship that would be in store if I became the editor, and I got the point and started my own paper with my comrades from a district-wide dissident student organization, and of course, we named it such that when it was prohibited, they would have to say, there will be no distribution of freedom of the press on campus. So anyway, instead of going to college, I took a job for $15 a week, editing an underground newspaper for the high schools of the San Francisco Bay Area. The rent, by the way, was $30 a month. My circle of folks there in the Bay Area was under the influence of Stop the Draft Week, which shut down the streets of Oakland. Yay, they needed shutting. There was an Army induction center there, after all. Also influential were the Movement newspaper and the Black Panthers. This journalism job was followed by a brilliant career move, becoming a songwriter for the Students for a Democratic Society, where the real money was. In the spring of 1969, I wrote the deathless classic, Frack U.S. Imperialism. Actually, we didn't have fracking then, so I called it something similar.
Fuck U.S. imperialism. Get the fuck out of my town. Come on and fuck you.
In fact, it became a trilogy, the first installment of which was sung at a rally to curtail the freedom of speech. I repeat, to curtail the freedom of speech of an employment recruiter for the United Fruit Company, who came to the University of Washington campus to recruit students to help slaughter our Guatemalan indigenous brothers and sisters in the name of the almighty banana, or dollar. This rally landed my older brother and others in the dock for some kind of charge which should have been disturbing the slaughter, but for some reason they did not call it that, and I myself, for singing the song, was honored with the title of unindicted co-conspirator, if memory serves. A short note about what was going on, often just outside my view, sometimes within it, in those days. My high school graduation was marked by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which continued through my first spring out in the world. The Orangeburg Massacre in South Carolina came on February 8, 1968. I was far away, protected by geography and race, and probably didn't even hear about it as we didn't have Twitter then. Black students went to a whites-only bowling alley. The police fired into the crowd, killing 3 and wounding 27. Then came President Johnson's March 31st announcement that he would retire. 4 days later, King was assassinated. May 4th was Kent State. 10 days later, police killed 2 students at Jackson State in Mississippi. On May 17th, 9 Catholic activists, including the Berrigan brothers, burned draft cards in Catonsville, Maryland. All the while, bubbling revolt in Prague, widespread street fighting in Paris, strikes and occupations at Columbia University and San Francisco State. In the summer, the youth would be bloodied in Chicago, and in the fall, students were massacred in Mexico City. With all that going on, it only made sense that the people who were more or less in power would try to find out why people were rebelling against them. So it was that the Young Presidents Organization, a group of young-ish corporate presidents, scheduled discussions at a conference in Aspen, Colorado in the spring of 1969. They were forced by the noted scholar of youthful rebellion, Edgar Z. Friedenberg, who said that he was only coming to the conference to argue with Zbigniew Brzezinski, to invite his old comrade, yours truly, to address them on this subject. Then there was, of course, an escalation of the battles here at home on many fronts, including mine, which you see here along with a profile as well. If they thought of me as an outlaw, it might have been partly because of this newspaper I helped put together for a while in 1970, most of it well-intentioned nonsense. But as the military draft ended and our righteous rage, middle class as it was for some of us, burned lower, some activists moved to the country, some found a new age, some went underground fighting on for a time. I, after a bit of floundering in the swirling waters of post-60s disorientation, I forgot about the drugs, never mind that. I should say I did take 5 years off of politics in the 70s, during which I did a few other things that are kind of hard to explain. Then I connected with the Central American freedom movements that were being thwarted and slaughtered by my government, as is their habit, and then I joined, of all things, a political comedy group called the Plutonium Players, who were fomenting a show called the Reagan for Shah campaign. In order to join the campaign, you had to write your own material, including a character, and for some reason we tended to write right-wing characters mostly, so I thought, well, it's kind of weird that the vice president, a Mr. G.H.W. Bush, used to be head of the CIA. That was considered a bit too much in those innocent days. So I undertook to introduce the singing CIA agent from the Committee to Intervene Anywhere, a Mr. George Shrub. You have to keep in mind that in those days there was no Daily Show, no Colbert, no John Oliver. The point being that I'm not actually needed anymore for that kind of performance, but at the time it seemed to fill a void. Agent Shrub initially didn't speak, odd as that may seem for me. He just talked the talking blues, but eventually he became rather long-winded and never did shut up until I finally shut him up myself a few years back. This character was particularly on point for those who were struggling against United States interventions where people had the temerity to revolt against the aforementioned United Fruit Company and various other types of U.S.-funded dictatorships. So, I easily achieved prominence in those circles, since who else was doing comedy about massacres at the time? A side note, I was once asked by Oxfam in London to do a comedy evening about their focus country of that year, Kampuchea. I said to them, I think my words were, "Are you crazy?" But I did it, and it worked. I then took that material on the road there in England, and lo and behold, it didn't work. Because nobody could figure out why I was doing it, and they were perhaps also properly horrified at the very concept, as I had been a few days earlier. I then manufactured or gave birth to other characters, including the moderate clear-cutter George Stump, Seymour the downwardly mobile urban post-professional, or Dumpy, and later Wild Bill Bailout, the Bard of the Bankers, seen here at Occupy Wall Street, and semi-finally a third cousin twice removed of President 2-year-old Davy Drumpf. I also continued to appear in my clever impersonation of myself. Doing comedic music was what set me apart from most folkies and comedians. I was already that type of a near musician, commonly known as a folk musician. So, I proceeded with my near music into a section of the music business that can be accurately described as anti-showbiz. First, because of the, negative cash flow, and later because I learned to hate showbiz, not least because of my negative cash flow. Despite the lack of a cash stash, I persisted in making recordings which were released in an increasingly bizarre array of formats no young person today has ever seen. Round things with various sizes of holes in them, little plastic boxes with some kind of thin ribbon going around inside, etc. I've done 14 of these and maybe another 28 units worth of virtual digital productions of some sort that live in a cloud somewhere or everywhere. Oh, P.S. I did go to grad school much later and got a master's in communications, and no, it does not show, but it did get me a job briefly doing this. And a few other things. Many of my songs I should not expect to be paid for, as they're not exactly what's the word I'm looking for, my songs. I certainly rescued them. I'm in rescue work. Yeah, I'm kind of a third responder. I find songs that are worn out, need new parts or a tune-up, and I fix them. New lyrics with perhaps more relevance. We might say I repair worn-out songs. Let's say that, to cover up what it really is. Or let's just call it the folk process on steroids. My theory is that through the magic of the marketplace, the number of topics that popularly successful songwriters are permitted to cover was long ago reduced to approximately 1. Therefore, our brightest songwriting minds are imprisoned by their careers in a cell of alleged love songs. Or, as a permitted alternative, songs that seem to be talking about a lot of things, but on repeated listenings, you still can't tell what those things might be. Beautifully crafted lyrics signifying perhaps something, or not. So by revisiting those songs and slapping them brutally with socially relevant, even useful lyrics, I like to think I'm rescuing those songs and those writers from their cells. One time, a fellow who had heard a familiar song somewhere came to Mr. Guthrie and said, "Woody, that man stole your song." And Woody said, "Sure he did, but I stole from everybody." We politely call that the folk process. I have had a pretty good desk in the social justice movement because I got to laugh all the time, and I got to have people laugh with me and maybe at me. The ability to be joyful and wickedly humorous is a sign of a healthy and growing community and movement. Retirement? I think first you're supposed to have a job. But more important than having a big house and being famous in it is what you accomplish and whether you have any fun in life, which of course are two different things. Creating is fun, and getting some recognition too. But about accomplishing, of course, a person who creates something to be of use is more effective if it gets used. But if I had to answer, well, what effect have you had? which I do ethically have to answer, I would say I sometimes helped make activists happier to be activists. That's kind of important. And more rarely, I've helped them to think, which I think is probably important too.
Worldwide social justice movements have certainly helped me to think, and that's the moral of the story. I think.